Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity. We hope you're all well and safe as the Thanksgiving holiday quickly approaches. At Trinity, we are thankful to all the members of the community who have enabled the college to operate quite safely and effectively during the pandemic. This includes many of you as alumni, parents, and friends of the college who have offered spoken and written words of support and encouragement to our students, faculty, and staff. To the many of you who have offered career advice and support to each other and to our students during a challenging economy, and to so many of you who have contributed financially to support the regular and emergency needs of the students and faculty in the last 8 months. Trinity is indeed a special family, and we are grateful. I mention this tonight because, believe it or not, our students will be heading home after tomorrow. As was presciently planned months ago, the on-campus portion of the semester is coming to an end, and they're heading home for the holidays and to finish the semester virtually. Tonight, we're thrilled to bring you another virtual long walk program that allows us to celebrate the remarkable success of a Trinity alumna, Kristine Belson. And I'm equally excited to introduce the leader of our institution, who was eager to host tonight's conversation, President Joanne Berger-Sweeney, who fortunately has an advanced degree in public health, has quite ably led the college through these turbulent times, and hopefully will be able to take a few days off with her family next week to be thankful for so much. But for now, her work goes on, and I'm proud to turn tonight's program over to her with one quick housekeeping note. Thanks to the dozens of you who submitted questions for Kristine in advance, we'll get to as many of those as possible tonight. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to President Berger-Sweeney. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So first of all, I want to welcome you all to this virtual long walk event. I do hope that you and your families are safe. We all know that COVID is surging around the country, but I hope that maybe just for an hour, we turn our minds a little bit to something else, to animation and imagination, and that you will enjoy this conversation that we will have with Kristine Belson from the class of 1986. So I have a little bit of introduction before I start asking her some of the questions that you submitted. So Kristine, as the president of Sony Pictures Animation, both features and series, is responsible for spearheading the studio's strategy and growth, as well as overseeing the development and production of all theatrical, serial, and short form content for the Sony Pictures Animation slate. Sony Animation most recently collaborated with filmmaker Matthew A. Cherry on the short film Hair Love, which won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short earlier this year. And I'm so pleased to say that last night, I actually had the opportunity to watch it online, and maybe it's because I was a little Black girl with hair that I was trying to figure out, and that my father was trying to figure out sometimes what to do with. It was a story that just actually touched me incredibly. So, just so happy to be interviewing you after that incredible film. Also, the studio's previous feature release, the critically acclaimed Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature last year. Sony Picture Animation's past releases include the mouth-watering Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and the monster comedy Hotel Transylvania, that film series. The studio's upcoming release slate includes the action comedy Connected, produced by SpiderVerse filmmakers, Vivo, Sony Picture Animation's first ever animated musical featuring all new songs from Lin-Manuel Miranda, that probably most of you know from Hamilton, and another in the Hotel Transylvania franchise that's due out all next year. And we will be able to ask Kristine kind of how COVID may have or may not have interrupted the schedule of the release of some of these films. Kristine joined Sony Pictures Animation in 2015 after spending nearly a decade at DreamWorks Animation, where she produced the Oscar-nominated animated feature The Croods. She also served as executive producer of the Oscar-nominated How to Train Your Dragon. Kristine joined DreamWorks Animation with over 15 years of experience developing and producing live action and animated films for the Jim Henson Company, Columbia Pictures, Turner Pictures, and 20th Century Fox. Well, that is quite an impressive resume, Kristine, and I'd like to say welcome. We are very proud to have you in this series and very proud to have you as a Trinity College alum. So that's where I'm going to start my questions. It's terrific to have you here and everybody who is joining us. I'd like to hear a little bit about your Trinity story. How did you end up at Trinity College?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm incredibly flattered and excited to be here. So thank you very, very much. You know, I just to go back a little bit, you know, my story is my mom was Swedish and sort of a restless soul. And from a young age, I sort of moved around a lot. We lived all over the world in Berkeley, California, and Hawaii, and Sweden, and different places in Spain, and Morocco and Vermont. And I eventually returned to Los Angeles, where I attended middle school and high school. But the point I'm really getting at is, in high school, my parents were working and traveling, and I was largely left to my own devices. It was the late 70s in Hollywood. So parenting styles were pretty different from what I think we're used to now. They were really lax. I was kind of on my own in terms of the college application process. And so I applied to a bunch of East Coast sort of classic liberal arts colleges without really understanding the differences between them very well. I knew I wanted that sort of classic New England, you know, liberal arts experience that I'd heard about, that I'd seen pictures of. And I was honestly lucky enough to get an interview at Trinity. I think that's what made a big difference, because it not only helped get me admitted, but it caused me to feel more connected to the school. Obviously, the presence of Cinestudio was exciting for me. And my academic focus eventually was English and film at the school.
Right. So had you lived on the East Coast before? You spoke about Europe and California, but was this your first venture to really live on the East Coast?
I had lived in Vermont as a child, but I didn't have any friends on the East Coast, and I didn't know anybody who was going to Trinity. So yeah, when I showed up, I didn't know a soul. And I felt really different, honestly. Again, it was this, so it was like 1982, and I was kind of like a punk rocker in LA. So I had like a very different look when I showed up at college. I was like, oh, right, everybody kind of looks a little bit different than me and maybe talks a little bit differently than I did. But it was great. It was exactly what I wanted. I really wanted a big change of pace, and I got one.
Right, you sure did. So you were speaking before about your parents.
Yes.
And your father was a writer, right?
Yep.
For television.
Yeah.
So maybe share, how much did that influence what you're doing or not influence what you're doing? Was it a positive or negative influence?
It was a big influence. And actually both my parents at that point were working in the entertainment industry. My dad had been working in TV for a long time and was writing movies. And my mother, they were divorced, but she was working for the Hollywood Foreign Press, which is a journalistic organization, writing about the entertainment industry. And the reaction that caused in me was, no way, I am not going to be in the entertainment industry at all. So I came into Trinity actually thinking that I wanted to be pre-med. And that, it didn't last last that long. It took one college level chemistry course that caused me to go back to my safe place, which was English. And I will say I have no regrets. But after college, you know, I still wasn't getting it. I was like, I'm not working in the movie business or the series business. I tried working in the publishing world. I tried theater. I worked production a little bit. And I just kept eliminating things and figuring out what I didn't want to do on my way to figuring out what I did want to do.
Right. And so tell us a little bit about that first job you had after Trinity College, because, you know, you're talking about a slightly circuitous route. Now, did you stay on the East Coast or did you immediately go back west and start some of these other?
I didn't. I was like, I'm an East Coaster. I'm a New Yorker. We were talking before, Joanne, you know, you're from LA, you went to the East Coast. I was like, I have found my people. I have found my place. I'm East Coast, I'm New York. No way am I entertainment industry. No way am I LA. Well, but it turns out I was in the end. So I did those jobs that I mentioned that I tried my hand at. That was in New York. And eventually I realized, you know what, I should go back to LA and I should just give this a try. And so I did finally go back. And my first job in the entertainment industry was at CAA, which stands for Creative Artists Agency. It's one of the big talent agencies. You know, and I was a reader, which was it's a very entry level job. You know, it meant that I read scripts and books, and I wrote synopses and analyses of them in a basement with a bunch of really angry screenwriters, because that's what most script readers were at the time, were like really frustrated screenwriters. But I wasn't an aspiring screenwriter, so I wasn't frustrated. I was actually really excited because I had finally found something that I really enjoyed doing and that I thought I was pretty good at, which was like reading, analyzing, and discussing and sort of breaking down stories for the screen. So that's like what I consider my first real job that got me on the path, was that job being a reader at CAA.
Right. That's terrific. So how did you get into animated film?
It took a
as
really
opposed to real. And then I'm going to probe a little bit kind of what the differences you think between animation and real, and kind of why you chose that as your passion.
Yeah, and I wasn't thinking about animation at all. In fact, I wasn't a person who really watched a lot of animation. I only started to watch animation once I had kids. My kids are 21 and 23, so that long ago. And so, yeah, after CAA, I got a job working for a live action producer. And as my career progressed, I was happily working on the live action side. I was sometimes working as a producer and sometimes as a studio executive, but I was working on live action movies, no experience in animation or even really in family films. But as I said, just as I was having my two kids, I started watching animation. I also started at that time working at the Henson Company. So I was turning my focus to family entertainment, and it was starting to really interest me, the whole idea of family entertainment, but I still didn't get animation. So I was like happily making Muppet movies for the Henson Company, and I got approached by DreamWorks Animation. And I had been, as I said, watching a lot of animation because of my kids. And this was this moment when like Pixar was in their prime. They had made a string of amazing movies, Toy Story 2, Finding Nemo, but then they made The Incredibles, which is like one of the greatest movies ever made. And it was a truly exciting time for animation, and like the temptation to make that professional shift to animation was just so powerful. So I was scared to do it. You know, I didn't know really anything about animation, but I went to DreamWorks Animation and I spent 10 years there. And I learned everything I know about making animated movies. And then about 6 years ago, I was invited to come run Sony's animation division.
Right. So, you know, as you mentioned, The Incredibles, which was indeed an incredible movie, but I think I remember that the Spider-Verse actually beat out The Incredibles 2 for the Academy Award a year ago. So that must have felt pretty amazing to, you know.
It's a funny feeling because of course, like it was unbelievably gratifying, and Brad Bird, who's the creator of both movies, couldn't have been more gracious, but it is almost a strange feeling. Like, I mean, I worship, and so many of us worship at the altar of Brad Bird. Like it felt like, I don't know, it was a mixed bag, because you're like, yes, of course we're thrilled. This is amazing, but wow, really? Brad Bird didn't win? But it was, but it felt nice, Joanne. It felt good.
Yeah, it had to have.
It did.
So you also mentioned about animation, that you kind of started watching it with your children. But it feels to me like animation is no longer just for kids.
Thank you.
I mean, have you found that the audience really has broadened for animation, or is it just as I get older, I continue to watch it?
No, I could go on and on about this topic. So there is a total misconception that animation is meant for kids, which actually, I think I should say there was a misconception. I don't think anyone's confused about this anymore. And I don't think it's because you're changing. I think it's the world is changing around you. I think there's so much more available. And it's like, as a lot of people know, the US is kind of has been behind, not anymore, but the US was sort of slow to embrace animation for adults, whereas in other parts of the world, in Europe or in Asia, that was always an accepted and established thing. But now, if you're just talking about US, animation in this country is consumed by everyone, and the rise of all the streaming services has made so much available. And to bring it back to The Incredibles, when that movie came out, it changed everyone's idea of what an animated movie was and who it was for. And we talked about this all the time. We were like, we hope and pray that our Spider-Verse movie could do what The Incredibles did, to sort of build on that and keep going and keep expanding the boundaries of like how you define an animated movie, but also who an audience for an animated movie is. And thank goodness it worked, and it did. The audience that showed up for the Spider-Verse movie was the kind of audience that shows up for a Marvel movie, which is to say, sure, there's families there, parents and kids, but there were tons of adults, like with no kids in sight. And that was a really, really big deal. But again, you know, what's available now on the streaming services is incredible. I mean, there's so much anime. I mean, anime is exploding. Everyone's obsessed with anime now. And there's so much to see. And Japan has been making incredible animation for just decades and decades. I mean, they are masters. And then there's all this great series stuff for adults. You know, there's so much wonderful stuff and different kinds of series. People know about BoJack and Big Mouth and those comedies, but there's lots of strange and unusual things to discover out there. So it is like such a booming time in US animation. The industry just keeps expanding.
Right. So are there things, you know, in some ways this is an obvious question. Are there things that you can do in animated films that you can't in real films? The answer is obviously yes, but maybe compare a little bit some of the pros and cons of one art form versus the other.
You know, I'm trying to decide whether to talk, maybe I'll talk about both. For me, because I make them, what my mind goes to is like the difference in the process of making them. Okay. So maybe I'll start there and then talk more about, like, from the audience point of view, the difference. The reason when I found myself in animation, I was like, I am never, ever going back to live action, is because animation is like, I've never done this, but what I've had it described to me, it's like workshopping a play. You get to keep iterating and iterating. So we have this process where, you know, a director and a writer will hunker down with a team of story artists and visual artists and start putting the movie up, by which we mean making beautiful concept paintings that help us understand what the movie is going to look like. But the storyboard artists are actually taking those scenes and drawing them out, and we put voices on them and we cut it all together like you do a live action film, and then you get to watch your movie in drawing form. It's not beautifully animated or lit yet. It's kind of rough drawings, but still you get to experience that 90 minutes or however long it is of the movie. And then invariably you're like, oh my God, act one is great. Act two is awful or whatever it is. And this part works, this part is a disaster. And then you sit around, you talk about it, you rewrite it, you go back to work, you do it again, and you get to look at it again. And that is why a lot of animated movies feel very kind of polished and honed and sort of perfected. A lot of like some of Pixar's best movies, they've spent, 8 years or more making these movies. They iterate and iterate. So going back to my live action experience, I can remember so clearly and like painfully, you're on set and the day is going slow and you didn't get everything you wanted. You didn't get the performance, you didn't get the angles on that scene. And you're done. You gotta wrap. The day is done and you gotta get out of there and you're packing up and you're moving out of the location and you're going somewhere else and you're never coming back. And like, it would drive me mentally insane. I was like, I couldn't bear it that we didn't get like another chance to fix it. So animation is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly iterative. And that I think makes a big, big difference. I think another thing is, now I'm going to try to flip to like from the audience point of view. Part of it is, I do think that again, these animated movies, the best ones have this sense of being these finely honed gems almost as it were because of that iterative process. But I think, I was watching our latest film Connected, which hasn't released yet because theatrical is not happening right now. But I was just watching it. It's so beautifully animated. It has a very bold style. And I was just thinking about how like animated movies, even more than live action movies, which I love so much, as do we all, they have the ability to transport the audience because everything is created from the ground up in animation, from the characters to the environments, the rules of the world. It's just more of a departure from reality. It's like another way of saying it is like a tree in a live action movie, you're shooting a tree. A tree in an animated movie is never just a real tree. It's an artist's or a storyteller's interpretation of a tree. Like everything passes through an artistic filter. So I don't know, it's just this total vision, this total immersive experience.
Right. I mean, I think it requires a kind of creativity to do animation because it's not just capturing what is, it's adding to it and, and kind of imagining what things could be and trying to capture that on a film. Now, I have another question that's a little off script, and it's trying to understand a little bit the finance of those two, because I stop and think if it takes 8 years to create, an animated film, now maybe you're not paying actors or paying them in a different way, but the cost of that versus a live action film, I guess.
Well, but there's just a huge,
but what?
Yeah, but there's a huge range, right? So like an animated movie could cost $5 million or cost $205 million. And the same is true for a live action film. But I think what you are speaking to is sort of the big mainstream movies that we see out there in the theaters. And so generally speaking, and there really is a pretty big range even here, but generally speaking, those sort of big 4-quadrant animated movies, whether they're the ones from our studio, which you generously named earlier, or a Pixar movie, they cost, and I know this is a big range, somewhere between 80 million and 200 million. The big differential is it's a function of time. So like we will take 4 years to make a movie and Pixar could take up to 8 or more. And so there really is a big range. Most of the big theatrical movies that are out there competing, there's so many of them are superhero movies now and big sort of action adventure movies. Those movies are kind of in, I would say they're actually kind of in a similar budget range where it's like around 80 to 150, 200 being very expensive, obviously.
Right. I have a question that I see here in the chat function, and it's talking about, to your point of animation being an iterative process.
Yeah.
How do you protect against touching it up too much.
Against touching it up too much?
Too much, you know? So the person is saying, like, when do you stop iterating?
Oh,
Kind of, when do you know
well, I
when
have two
it's
different
done?
answers to this question. One, when they rip it out of our hands, like that is one part of it is like, it's like, you're done. And we're like, no, we're not done. It's like, you've literally, the movie needs to get distributed around the world so that people can enter the theaters and see it. You must finish it now. I also wonder if that question is speaking to something else, which I find interesting. This is really embarrassing. I thought I had fed my cat so that my cat would leave me alone. He's outside my door, scratching and meowing. I'm going to walk off camera for 1 minute and let him in so he leaves me alone. He may be now in frame, so hold on.
Okay, don't worry. And maybe what I will do is look to see if there are other questions in the chat that I might be able to ask.
And I also texted my husband saying, help, help. And I think he did. The cat's
I had to do that on Monday. My dog was barking. And, you know, I said to someone, I'm really glad that I dressed not just at the top that you see, but all the way through. Because if I walked back there,
know, right?
you know, with my, you know, tennis shoes on, or it would have looked a little odd if I would have had sweatpants on below something like this.
So funny. I see, yeah, your door's back there. I've gotten used to going off camera this way and like sneaking to the door. But I'll start talking about the other question while you look in the chat.
Okay.
But,
Right.
I'm kind of wondering if that question might also speak to something I find very interesting, which is how CG movies can feel too polished and too clean and too perfect. And it's actually something we feel really strongly about. And in SpiderVerse, we try to show sort of a lot of imperfections. And in this movie called Connected, which again isn't released yet, we dropped a teaser trailer for this movie a long time ago. It only shows you a little bit of the movie because it's just the teaser, not the full trailer. But we worked really, really hard in that movie actually to represent real life and a real family where things are frayed and not perfect, and the curtains are kind of ripped, and you don't, you know, I'm actually speaking to a lot of things. The family in that movie, a lot of times in animated movies, everybody's sort of like very upper middle class. So we wanted to show a family that lived more like most families do in this country. But again, that extended down to the design choices of not having everything be so polished and touched up, which is what I'm wondering if that question was after.
Maybe. Now, I want to go back to something else that you mentioned a bit earlier. And you were talking about the influence of both European and, you know, I think a lot of us know about Japanese anime. So can you talk a little bit about how that has influenced the way that you think about and see animated film production?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously hugely influenced by, I mean, we're influenced by everything. We're influenced by photography and fine art and live action, but clearly a huge source of inspiration. And I can't even include myself in this, right? Because as I've described, I'm still new to this. There are people who spent their entire lives since childhood studying this, you know, art form and are so knowledgeable, and I can't pretend to touch that. But yes, obviously I do, and we all do watch a lot of different stuff. And the really cool thing about animation that maybe everybody doesn't know is it's got a really deep history all around the world. Like the earliest forms of animation, you know, existed starting in like the late 1800s, around the time that the earliest surviving live action photographed footage exists from. And there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's so much variety. And I'm still learning every day. I mean, honestly, I feel like I'm never going to catch up to all of it, but somebody turned me on to something cool. If there's people here watching because they're interested in animation, somebody just turned me on to a great piece that ran in New York Magazine's Vulture blog last month. And it describes the 100 sequences that shaped animation. And I would seriously recommend that to anyone who wants to learn more about the history of animation and just how like diverse the medium is all around the world. So again, it's from the Vulture blog in New York Mag, 100 sequences that shaped animation. Check it out.
All right, that's terrific. A number of the questions that I see in the chat have to do with how do you break into the industry? How do you break into perhaps animation in particular? And, you know, many of the people I think who are writing don't necessarily have family connections and wonder how do you start?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which side you want to be on. So let's say that you want to be an artist. Obviously, having a portfolio is a really good start. And you know, a lot of people have traditionally, people in animation all went to some sort of graduate program that trained them for that. And there are sort of certain schools, Gobelin in France, Cal Arts in California, that are like known for this. And it was like, you know, there was a time where like Disney was just filled with people only from Cal Arts. That has changed a lot. The internet has changed everything, including this. You can get a great animation education now if you're an artist online from a bunch. It's accessible in a way that it wasn't. It was elitist before. It was very difficult. And so now there's been this leveling, which is amazing. So you need to get some training, you need to get your portfolio together, and then there are recruiters at every animation studio, and they go around to schools. So if you are in one of these sort of graduate programs, they'll probably come by at some point if you're at a place that has any kind of sort of reputation in the field. But otherwise, you reach out to these studios and production companies. You know, there are the big animation studios, us and Disney and Pixar and DreamWorks and all that. And then there's all these production companies that, you know, you just pick a movie that you loved or a show, a series that you love, and go research online who made that, and find the recruiter inside that company and ask the recruiter to look at your portfolio. If you're interested in doing what I do, which is being on the executive or producer side, you get an entry-level job. Again, same thing. You're trying to get your foot in the door. It's being an assistant is basically what it is. I started as an assistant. All my assistants at Sony Animation are now either have worked their way up on the production side or on the development side, which is more, you know, focused on the screen, the earlier part of development, and then the production emphasis sort of takes over once we're full swing in production. But and I believe in, you know, writing, you know, I've responded to cold calls and letters, you know, if they're written in a way that grabs my attention. Obviously, look for trainee positions, look for internships. We've got a lot of people inside our studio who started as trainees or interns. So hopefully that was a little bit helpful.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a hard industry to break in, but you have provided, you know, a lot of suggestions for people. Now I'm going to ask you
this. It is hard to get in, but the good news is, as we were talking about, it's expanded so much. There are so many different places you could work. Don't get discouraged. I was just saying this to my daughter, who's 23 and graduated with the class of COVID, and like could not get a job, got turned down like 50 times, and finally has a job. Don't worry about no. You're going to get told no
right
100 times. Don't let it get you down. You just need one yes. Just keep going. Someone's going to say yes, I promise.
Right. So as you've mentioned COVID, talk a little bit about how it has changed, maybe both your work as an individual, but also a little bit about the industry and kind of what you can and can't do.
Right.
Obviously,
I mean, look,
not go to theaters is one of the can't do's.
I mean, so that's the big one. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it was like to transition to working from home, but you know, the huge thing is what you said. I mean, people aren't going to the movies. So this is like, you know, it's devastatingly bad for our industry, and we'll survive it. And the industry has survived bad moments before, but it's a bad scene right now. So we feel fortunate because we can keep going. It was very different for physical production, which is live action production. You couldn't be together. Digital production, you can sit alone in a room and do it and connect over the internet. So we were able to keep going, but we don't have, we had a movie that was supposed to come out, and there's, I don't know when that movie's coming out. We've got another movie that's supposed to come out this June. I hope that happens. I'm not sure that it will but to speak again to our transition, we did feel really fortunate. And like back in March, when quarantine was called at our studio, and we have not come back. No one is back at our studio. Everyone is working remotely. But back in March, we were able to get, and I like talking about this because I'm really impressed by everybody who pulled this off. We got a fully functioning animation studio with 4 movies in production and 2 series in production. We got it all up and running remotely from people's homes in a matter of weeks, and it was hard, and but we managed to stay on schedule, and everybody was able to deliver their work, their artistic work, but also we had to collaborate. We had to record with actors. Suddenly, actors aren't coming into regular recording studios. We're sending them equipment that they're bringing into their home, and they're like hiding in their closets where it's like more muffled and it's a better sound quality, and trying to record that way. We had to record an entire film score remotely, but the musicians couldn't all be together in the same room. And our composer, I'm just realizing, was in the hospital with COVID during this. I mean, there were definitely challenges. But we were able to do it. And what's been interesting about it is a few things. I mean, one, it was honestly inspirational. Like, people really had to band together, and you really find out about people in tough times. And it was inspirational to see how everybody stepped up. And now we're in this groove of working from home, and in some ways we all feel like we know people better than we did. I'm like, I know what your kids look like. I know your pets, I see sandwich you're eating for lunch. Actually, we used to have lunch together, so that's not a good example. But as we were talking about when we were chatting before this started, we make comedies, like you can't hear laughter very well on a Zoom. We really miss being all together. To the laughter thing, one of the hardest things, and this thing we haven't been able to solve for, is test screenings. We're used to playing our movies in front of an audience and hearing them respond to it, and not having that as a tool has been a real bummer, a total challenge. And it's a bummer to not be together. Like, we miss each other. And so at the same time that I'm incredibly, incredibly eager to get back, I think it's going to be different in the future. I hope we can work smarter. I suspect that it's going to be a hybrid approach now, where some people will be on campus some of the time, and others, and LA is a very trafficky city, and we'll be able to maybe ameliorate that a bit. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like in the future, but it's going to look different.
But it's going to look different. And I wonder about theater going. When will people feel comfortable going back into theaters that are crowded and sitting next to other people? And I just wonder if you're thinking about perhaps creating more content for the small screen. Have you been talking about the shifts in the industry that may occur after or post-COVID, even once we have vaccines?
Absolutely. So, and by the way, it's been so interesting and strange. Like, so many of my meetings now are about this topic, like a bunch of movie executives sitting around talking about vaccines and science. Like, what do we know? We don't know what's going to happen. And so I think it is going to take a while before people feel comfortable. I do think theatrical will come back 100%, but I think it's going to take a while for that to happen. And there was already a whole shift happening theatrically pre-pandemic about the kinds of movies that people would go to theaters to see versus what they were more interested in seeing at home. Now, animation has always done really well in the theatrical world. Like, after the sort of superhero genre, which is wildly successful, we know, animated movies are kind of in the next best category in terms of like what people will get up out of their house and get in their car and put their pants on to go see. But nonetheless, we've seen it shifting, and we wanted to make, when I got to the studio, it's been almost 6 years now, day one, streaming content was a strategy for us, because we didn't just want to make 4-quadrant family films. We love doing that. It is our bread and butter. It is our main business. But when you're making a movie for literally everybody, you have to be careful about certain choices, and you can't make more adult choices about certain things. And it's just fun. In addition to making big movies that are for everyone, it's really fun to make smaller stories that are for a specific audience. And we didn't want to eliminate that possibility for ourselves. So it was rather unusual of us in fact, it was completely unusual that as a major animation studio, we were also already selling to the streamers series as well as movies. So yes, and it is definitely a growing piece of our strategy. I mean, we're pretty agnostic about this stuff. We just want people to see the movies, and theatrical is great, and at home is great too.
Right. So I'm going to take you back a little bit to our conversation. We may have even had a little bit of this off camera before we started, but tell me a little bit about what it feels like to win an Academy Award. Now, I think that you were probably just recently president when the SpiderVerse movie won, but obviously fully ensconced when, the Hair Love movie. So what does it feel like to be a part of that and recognized by your peers?
It's surreal and it's deeply gratifying. I think I felt the impact of it much more after the fact, having gotten that recognition. And it wasn't just the award. I mean, I feel like, let me say a few things, and I'm going to sound arrogant, but it's not on behalf of myself. I could never make that movie. It's on behalf of these unbelievable filmmakers who made a movie that I think is totally remarkable. What was pretty exciting about SpiderVerse is it didn't just win the big award, it won like every award. So we just kept thinking, oh my God, this is it. Like we're not going to win again. Like every single time we were like, oh, come on, like that's a fluke, including all the way to the end of the big prize. I am not kidding you. People wouldn't believe us. We were like, we don't think we're winning. We sincerely do not think we're winning tonight. And so it was pretty exciting and elating for me, just to see those people up there who had given everything they had to make that movie. Making that movie was very challenging. It was really hard to do, and people worked around the clock for, years, honestly. And
so what was so hard about it? I mean, I can imagine on having seen it visually, but from your perspective, why was it so hard for them?
Why it was so hard is it was a huge gamble. It was scary because we knew we were doing something really different and we didn't know if audiences would like it. So we always had this like fear in the back of our minds, like, what if they hate it? But the thing that was really hard day to day is we had to invent this new production pipeline, because the existing animation pipelines couldn't make a movie that looked like that. We basically had to break the pipeline and build a new one. And we were trying all these new things and we just didn't know if they would work. And so when the gamble paid off and we finally got to show it to people and we understood, oh my goodness, thank God, this is actually gonna work. It was hugely gratifying. And I think, again, this may sound like false humility, but I mean it super sincerely. Winning the Oscar, it's great, it's fantastic. It sits in a case in our lobby and it's wonderful. It was more about the recognition that we were getting from our colleagues, from other artists and other filmmakers who, I remember the summer after the movie came out, we were at something called the Annecy Animation Festival, which is the big animation festival of the year. And everywhere you went, people were talking about how it had impacted them and how it changed what they were doing, how they suddenly felt free to do things that were bolder and more different. And the fact that that SpiderVerse team had like paved the way, not only for ourselves, like now we were like, oh no, now the bar is even higher. Like we have to keep reaching higher. But for all the other studios and artists and creators to like take that creative license that's built into the animation medium and just bet big on new and bold things, that part, like that was heady to feel like, oh my God, we actually kind of like influence in a meaningful way the industry. That felt big to me.
Right. Well, you were talking about breaking the pipeline to create the film. So can you share a little bit more? What did that mean?
Well, now I so wish that my head of production was here because it's technical stuff that I barely understand well enough
Okay.
to talk about. But there's a few things like, the movie has a real, it combines a 3-dimensional CG look with a flat 2D look. Believe it or not, you'd think the 2D flat thing is easy. That was so hard to do that in a CG pipeline. Also, the animation, the way we were doing it, the flatness was giving, when they would move, it was creating this strange quality to the motion and creating all kinds of motion blur that we didn't want. And so they had to, again, just say all the tools we've ever used don't work anymore. We have to throw those tools away and do this differently because the frame rates were different and everything. It was just, and literally like 100 other things that I'm not smart enough to explain to you, but they had to basically start fresh. They couldn't use the pipeline that they used to make Hotel Transylvania for SpiderVerse.
Right.
And it took a really long time for the shots to come out. Like we didn't know what things were going to look like for an extremely long time. So it was really nerve-wracking.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Hair Love. As I shared with you, I found it such a compelling story. I could see myself as part of it. But do you see that as opening up the world a little bit more to more stories from a more diverse group of people, given how well that story was received?
Absolutely. I mean, I've never been involved with anything like Hair Love before. I thought I had because SpiderVerse really captured like the public conversation and it meant something to people. And this idea that anyone could wear the mask. And, I still remember it when Miles took his mask off.
Right.
You saw a not white face. You were like, oh my God, it felt meaningful. It meant something, but but that was one thing. I'd never been involved with anything like Hair Love where it meant so much. And this young man, Matthew Cherry, is so remarkable. He made something in a moment where it became part of a national dialogue that was going on. And there were all these, discussions and disputes around the country about the Crown Act, where boys were having to wear their hair a certain way. And it was everywhere. And it meant so much to people personally. And I got insight into something I knew nothing about. And it was powerful. I mean, so in some ways that win was more powerful. I mean, it was so gratifying. And yes, we absolutely want to keep opening up stories like that, both in the smaller screen stories, but definitely in the big mainstream ones as well. And I think, we talk about this a lot on the live action side and the animation side. Like people want to see themselves represented in the movies and shows they watch, and it makes you feel more engaged. It makes you more interested, and it's actually good business to be inclusive. Like a lot of times people talk about it like, oh, it's the right thing to do. And I'm like, well, it is for sure, but actually it's the smart thing to do. You will drive business by being inclusive. So for us, we're super glad for the recognition on SpiderVerse and Hair Love, but we feel like we have a lot of work still to do in the area of authentic representation. So we're hoping to keep driving down that road.
Right. So can I ask a little bit back to one of our earlier questions about, the difference between an executive producer and a producer and a director, and clearly an animator, and animated films play a different role. So can you share, for example, what was your role in something like Hair Love? Kind of what piece do you play in this?
Right. Well, I mean, as a studio executive, and maybe I'll speak to some of the other roles because maybe they're actually a little bit more interesting than being an executive. But, as an executive, you're there to like support and help them. So like, I'm not there every day making it. I'm checking in, I'm coming by, they're showing stuff. us executives work as fresh eyes to say like, hey, you know, for somebody who's seen this for the first time, this is great, but this part's a little confusing or unappealing.
Mhm.
And then it's a lot about like, what do you need? What do you need to be successful? Like, do you have what you need? Um,
Right.
so now the other roles. A director in animation is a very intensive job. We joke about it because it takes a long time to make these movies, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years.
Right.
But it's like a marathon, but you run it sort of at a sprinter's pace. It's, I don't know what it is, but it's like, it's a long haul. For the producers too, and you know, what does it look like? You're holed up with storyboard artists and visual artists and a screenwriter, and you are, as I can't remember if we were talking about this before the camera's on or when this started about that. Oh, I think we talked about it here, that iterative process,
Yeah,
where you get to put
here.
it up, the drawn version of your movie, and look at it and tear it to pieces and keep going. But there's whole other aspects of the process too, you know. Then there's the building of the models and the creating of the world in the CG environment, in the CG pipeline, and overseeing that to make sure everything looks right. And then there's the overseeing the animation, which is all the performance, all the voice recordings with the actors, which are so important that they've got to be perfect.
Mhm.
The lighting, the camera choices. I mean, in those ways, you're very parallel to live action direct.
Mhm.
You have to make. And then a producer is there. I mean, I'm actually going to make the producer job sound a little bit like the studio executive job, because I see it that way, which is you're really there to support and give feedback and help guide people towards success. But the producer is there every day. A studio executive comes by and checks in once or twice a week. The producer's there morning, noon, and night. An executive producer, it can be very different on different shows, but an executive producer generally is somebody who has a role in the movie, but they're not required there every day. They maybe come to every screening, so they're there every 3 months, and they spend a couple days with you after the screening talking about, you know, what's working and what's not, but they're not going to be there every day.
Right. Terrific. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time. So I'm going to try and bring back the last question to Trinity College for a moment and ask if there were particular faculty members or staff members that served as inspiration. Were there particular places or departments? You mentioned Cine Studio as being important for you. So just share a little bit about what you remember from your time at
Well, my answer may be a little bit unusual, because I am going to talk about one professor, but then I'm going to talk about my friends. Listen, Cine Studio was hugely important. I had amazing, amazing memories from there. It's an incredible theater, and it's so remarkable that the campus has it.
It's really a gem.
It is so special, that place. The professor who really influenced me the most was Fred File. And Fred's been gone for a little while, but Fred taught English and film and was a teacher who had the most impact on me. He was really dynamic. He was really cool. And he was great at teaching film. And I can still remember, like a lot of colleges, a blur, but I remember these passionate discussions we would have in his classroom. He showed us all these films by a filmmaker named Douglas Sirk, who makes these very melodramatic movies. And the discussions we had around them were really bold and illuminating and amazing. But honestly, if I think about my other major inspiration, it was my friends. I was such a different person coming into college than the person who left. I was not actually very academic. I was like this kind of little bit of an LA wild child, and I changed so much during my 4 years at Trinity, and I think primarily because of the influence of a very tight-knit group of friends who I found myself in by way of dating one of them. And this was a crowd who liked to have fun, but while debating arts and politics and music, and they were so passionate about everything, and they really taught me a lot. So in addition to Fred File, I want to give thanks to right here and now to Tim, Lucian, Christian, Owen, Holly and Libby meeting you guys, if any of you are watching, as you threatened that you would.
We'll tape it and we'll send it to them if they're not.
Exactly. It actually, seriously, you guys, you had a huge, huge impact on me. So I love you and thank you.
What a wonderful answer, to my final question. And I want to share with you, having done a number of these interviews and obviously spoken to so many Trinity alumni, I think the word I hear most frequently is passion. There is something about this place that people feel passionately about. They are passionate about what they learn, their friends, and it's a combination of passion and interacting with other people. I've been at other places where academics are important, and something special in the sauce about Trinity is a combination of academics, passion, and people. And you actually just articulated all of that beautifully. You also spoke very passionately about Cinestudio. And so I'm going to invite you back to campus when we can fly again to make sure that you come and see the brand new, beautiful red velvet seats in Cinestudio.
Oh my God, that's so
It's
exciting.
really gorgeous. It's really gorgeous now.
I can't wait. I'm really excited to go back. I got to go back a few years ago with my kids and show them where I'd gone to college, and I can't wait to go back again. And, thank you for that invitation and the kind words. And sincerely, Trinity is so lucky to have you. You are such a wonderful leader for the school, and you make the institution proud.
Thank you. And you make us proud too. So until we can meet again in person, I say thank you. I don't know if Steve, you want to say any final words. We will probably try and capture some of the questions in the chat that we didn't have an opportunity to answer here on screen, and try and get back answers to as many of them as we can in the future. But anything else, Steve?
I'll let you close the evening, Madam President.
Oh, well then I close the evening by saying thank you again to Kristine Belson. And for about an hour, you took us out of the day-to-day and the humdrum and let us imagine and dream. And for that, I thank you sincerely.
Well, again, thank you so much. It was so lovely to get to hang out with you and talk to you. And we'll have to come hang out when you come to LA too.
Exactly. And if you need to feed the cat now or stop it from scratching.
The cat finally went away. I think he just finally gave up, which is good. And Steve, thank you so much for your help today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and to your team as well, Kristine. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Bye.
Stay safe.